growing up in England, I thought if you could run and jump and dunk the ball, that's what you needed to be a basketball player.
Michael Olowokandi should have never been the first pick in the NBA draft, not because he would go on to be a bust, but because he wasn't really a basketball player at all. On his 20th birthday, he decided he was going to play basketball collegiately, despite having next to no experience with the sport. By the time he turned 23, Commissioner David Stern was announcing his name, first overall, at the NBA draft. It was a mercurial rise, yet all you hear when it comes to Michael Olowokandi is what came after that moment, never living up to the hype, and the B word, bust. Was the center really a bust, though? Or was he simply a product of unrealistic expectations and proof that a dysfunctional NBA team will derail the development of any prospect? A player doomed by factors out of his control. The story of Michael Olowokandi is equal parts triumph and tragedy, overcoming adversity and failing to live up to burdensome expectations, an athlete who should be both celebrated and serve as a cautionary tale. This is the complicated legacy of Michael Olowokandi, bust, boom, or perhaps something else altogether. The late Bill Walton was never one to hide his disdain for Michael Olowokandi, and as the color commentator for the Los Angeles Clippers, no one had a bigger soapbox than him. You could make a case that the criticism lobbed at the center was fair, but it also ignored just how remarkable it was for him to even be there in the first place. To understand that, we must revisit one of the NBA draft's classic old wise tales, that being how Michael Olowokandi found himself playing basketball in the first place. The big man was born in Nigeria to a diplomat family. He would eventually go on to be schooled in England. He played sports growing up, mainly track and field along with some soccer and volleyball as well. His experience with basketball, though, it's a bit dusty. There have been various profile pieces pinned about Olowokandi over the years, yet each one seems to have a different story as it relates to his basketball background. Some claim he never played organized ball at any level. It's also been reported he had at least one tryout with a team in the British Basketball League. There are stories out there which would have you believe he had never even seen a basketball before coming to America. Regardless of what the truth actually happens to be, it's safe to say Olowokandi at the very least did not have much experience in the way of round ball and was still growing as an individual. In fact, he wouldn't develop into the 7-footer until later on in his teens. One day as a 20-year-old mechanical engineering student at Brunel University in the United Kingdom, Olowokandi found himself with a desire to be somewhere else doing something else. He knew his size meant basketball was a possibility in the United States. With that in mind, he grabbed a copy of Peterson's Guide to Four-Year Colleges and opened it to see which school he should contact. He landed on a page featuring the University of Pacific in little old Stockton, California. Olowokandi picked up a phone and somehow managed to get connected to the school's basketball office, where assistant coach Tony Markopoulos was on the line. There are only two details of this conversation that actually mattered. The first was that Olowokandi was 7'1". The second was that he didn't even want a scholarship. He was willing to pay his own tuition to make it to the University of Pacific. That was important because the Tigers didn't have a scholarship available. This conversation happened in April. With school starting in August, a lot of work was needed to get Olowokandi enrolled. He had to take the SAT, figure out how exactly his credits would transfer from England to Pacific, and there was also the question of how much eligibility he would have at UOP. Basically, the only thing that didn't matter was if Olowokandi was telling the truth about his height. Markopoulos did speak with someone who vouched for the big man, but no one at the school had seen him in person, let alone play basketball. Pacific head coach Bob Thomason and the rest of the staff had no idea if a legit 7-footer was going to meet them at the airport or if this was just some elaborate prank. Not that they had anything to lose, mind you, with Olowokandi paying his own way. At the very worst, UOP would simply be left with another student. Thankfully, Olowokandi was who he said he was. While he may have looked like a basketball player, Tigers coaches were going to be in for a rude awakening when he took the court for the first time. In an interview with FS Gate, Markopoulos described Olowokandi's first workout with the team as a disaster. Not only was the center in terrible shape, nowhere near the Division I standard, but Olowokandi had no real clue what he was doing on a basketball court. In many ways, he was hopeless. Thankfully, being 7'1" or thereabouts was simply enough to get you on the court in the Big West Conference. The hope in that first season in Stockton was that Olowokandi's size would intimidate the opposition. To a certain extent, it did work. In 10 minutes a game, he averaged 4 points, 3 rebounds, and more than a block. All things considered, not bad for a guy who looked worse than Stanley from The Office during his first basketball workout on the UOP campus. That summer was going to be massive for the big man's development. It was a chance for the coaching staff to give him a crash course on basketball. The first season was mostly trying to balance his understanding of the sport with trying to win games. This would determine if Olowokandi was simply a tall guy or a true basketball player. The results would speak for themselves. Olowokandi's second season in Stockton was a good one for both player and school. The center basically doubled his numbers across the board while going from a basketball novelty act to a solid role player for the Tigers. During non-conference play that season, he had a coming-out party of sorts, posting 16 points and 14 rebounds in a drubbing of Georgetown.
We had an opportunity to play against him, and he destroyed us with blocking shots and rebounding. But if you look at this tape, you'll see the fact how versatile he is.
When the regular season was said and done, Pacific would finish 1996-97 as co-regular season Big West champs, but would prove to be the best team in the conference tournament, winning, going away, and clinching a place in the NCAA tournament. Olowokandi had missed a few games during the regular season and was actually coming off the bench come tournament time. His performances were solid but didn't exactly scream number 1 overall pick incoming. As for March Madness, Pacific went in as a 13 seed but would fall in the first round to St. Joseph's. Heading into the senior season, expectations were high for both Olowokandi and UOP. The center, for his part, made a huge leap, averaging 22 points, 11 boards, and nearly 3 blocks a game. He shot better than 60% from the field and was skyrocketing up draft boards. As for Pacific, they were pretty good this season, beating Wisconsin and number 18 Fresno State during non-conference play while finishing as Big West regular season champs. Utah State was also good and would brush aside the Tigers in the Big West Conference Tournament championship game. It was unfortunate for a side that had won 16 straight games up until that point and were primed for a potential run in the NCAA tournament. UOP would receive a bid to the NIT, but were dumped out by Fresno State in the first round. It's important to understand Olowokandi's senior season from a bigger picture. His numbers were definitely good, but he wasn't named an All-American. It should also be said there wasn't a ton of talent in the Big West Conference at this time, so it was really difficult to gauge just how truly impressive he was. However, none of that mattered. The hype train had left the station and the next stop was the NBA draft. The early consensus was that Olowokandi was a lottery pick. After all, athletic 7-foot bigs don't just show up on your doorstep out of the blue. Well, unless of course you happen to be Pacific. The buzz around Olowokandi only grew stronger during the pre-draft workout circuit. In many ways, these were the perfect showcase for the center. Controlled workouts, oftentimes against no one, allowed Olowokandi to impress with his size, speed, and strength. In a Sports Illustrated article by Jackie McMullen, it was mentioned how he even ran a 4.55 40. Those performances, though, were simply the appetizer. The entree was potential. If the big man was able to do this with only 3 seasons of organized basketball experience, what was his ceiling?
I think they're going with Olowokandi not only because of Ike Austin and knowing that they can sign him, they just think that he has a great upside and he'll be a great basketball player someday.
This line of thinking is what made him the co-favorite to be selected with the first overall pick during the 1998 NBA draft. The other co-favorite? Mike Bibby, a point guard who in many ways was the exact opposite of Olowokandi. The son of NBA player Henry Bibby, Mike had been playing the game since his birth most likely. He was a known commodity, a safe pick.
They look at Bibby and they say he could be a solid point guard, maybe good. They don't know if he could be great.
All eyes would eventually turn towards the franchise selecting first in 1998, the Los Angeles Clippers. They had won 17 games the previous season and had fired head coach Bill Fitch. The Clips actually had the 3rd worst record in the NBA the previous year, but found fortune in the draft lottery to leapfrog both the Denver Nuggets and Toronto Raptors for the number 1 overall selection.
Talk for weeks and weeks was that Mike Bibby would be their number 1 pick. What swayed them toward the big fella?
Most intel had LA going with Bibby. They were in desperate need of a point guard and had actually drafted a center in the lottery 2 years earlier. Lorenzen Wright was still developing and showing some promise, so center wasn't exactly a pressing need. For whatever reason, Clippers general manager Elgin Baylor was not interested in that logic. He convinced LA owner Donald Sterling into the idea that Olowokandi was the guy. Then on June 24th, 1998, at the General Motors Place in Vancouver, British Columbia, well, you already know this part of the story.
With the first pick in the 1998 NBA draft, the Los Angeles Clippers select Michael Olowokandi from University of Pacific.
The second Olowokandi stepped off that stage, things began going sideways in his career. The NBA lockout would go into effect a week later, meaning the center could have zero contact with his new team. Perhaps worse yet, the Clippers didn't even have a coaching staff in place during that 1 week. Sterling refused to hire someone to replace Fitch as he didn't want to pay them during the lockout. Chris Ford wouldn't be hired until January 14th, 1999, 6 days before the lockout would officially end. Basically, the Clippers drafted Olowokandi, had him do a press conference in LA before the lockout began, and said, "See ya when we see ya." For a player in desperate need of coaching and guidance, this was the worst possible start to a professional career. Sure, he went out and found some help, even attending Pete Newell's big man camp in Hawaii. The center also spent a few hours each week under the tutelage of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, although their relationship would sour in the years to come. All this assistance was nice, but Olowokandi had no playbook from the Clippers, no idea on what kind of style the team would be playing, and no idea of what to expect when the league eventually resumed operations. It should also be stated a majority of NBA players did not stay in game shape during this lockout. It turns out Olowokandi was no different. On the eve of the lockout ending in January 1999, the center signed for Italian side Kinder Bologna and played a handful of games for the team. It was reported he looked alarmingly out of shape during this spell and was told his services were no longer needed by the club. Back in America, the center signed his rookie contract and a little over a week later would find himself coming off the bench in the Clippers' season opener against the Phoenix Suns. His first game? Pretty good, all things considered. He posted 14 points, 6 boards in 21 minutes. In fact, he really flashed in those first 3 games, scoring in double digits all 3 occasions. After those relatively successful outings, Ford then rushed him into the Clippers' starting lineup. That switch saw Olowokandi begin to regress. LA, meanwhile, was just a dumpster fire. The team would lose its first 17 games of the season, and their newly drafted center missed a few during this time. At the end of the day, this turned out to be a lost season for all parties involved. Ultimately, Olowokandi was overexposed in his rookie season. While he was able to come in at spots during his first season at Pacific, the Tiger coaching staff also knew that he wasn't ready for a heavy workload. To that effect, everyone outside the Clippers organization seemed to realize the big man was not an NBA-ready prospect and should have been allowed time to adjust to the pro game. Yet Chris Ford kept running them out there playing far too many minutes. Did Olowokandi have some moments during that rookie campaign? Absolutely, but he never really played a complete game. Red flags were visible, even if the situation wasn't entirely of his doing. Despite an uneven rookie year, there were reasons for optimism with an offseason of preparation and a full training camp at his disposal. After all, Olowokandi made a huge leap from year 1 to year 2 in college. It was possible the same would happen in the NBA. It didn't work out that way, though. The center led the Clippers in games played and starts, but there just wasn't much in the way of improvement. Head coach Chris Ford was fired midway through the season, with interim coach Jim Todd bringing aboard Kareem Abdul-Jabbar to assist him, with the focus being on Olowokandi's development. That made sense since the two had worked together during the lockout. Only something had changed. The Hall of Fame center has since gone on to say Olowokandi was uncoachable. The media would go on to have a field day with that statement, blasting the former #1 pick for not listening to Abdul-Jabbar, but there's something that really needs to be noted here. It's not as if the NBA legend was coming in at the start of a new season. He arrived in February, in the midst of a terrible year for the Clippers, in which no players seemed all that happy to be there. Abdul-Jabbar would not be with the Clippers coaching staff for long. He was shown the door 3 months later. To say he had a firm grasp on the goings-on with the franchise or Olowokandi is a bit of a stretch. Alvin Gentry was hired to be Clippers head coach ahead of the 2000-2001 season as the Clippers began building a young roster, including Lamar Odom, Darius Miles, Quentin Richardson, and Corey Maggette. Olowokandi started all 82 games that season, but played a tick under 26 minutes a game. His numbers were down across the board, even when compared to his rookie stats. The potential Olowokandi was billed for coming out of college never materialized after 3 seasons in the NBA. If anything, he had seemingly regressed. A combination of a terrible situation and potentially a bad attitude made it seem as if his time in LA was coming to an end. The team trading for Elton Brand in the offseason only added to that feeling. Instead, the opposite happened. The center finally showed signs of life. He would finish 7th in most improved player voting after averaging 11 points and nearly 9 rebounds. It wasn't all positive. His 43% field goal percentage certainly left a lot to be desired. As a team, this was the best Clippers season in some time. Even with Lamar Odom only appearing in 29 games, it was a different side with Brand in the mix. LA was even in the playoff hunt until early April. A stretch of 6 losses in 7 games dashed those hopes. This run didn't simply end the Clippers' playoff aspirations, it would also be the beginning of the end for Olowokandi in Southern California and really the NBA as a whole. After a loss against the Utah Jazz in April, Olowokandi made some comments about how the team wasn't playing together because players were uncertain about their future. In reality, he wasn't talking about the team. He was talking about himself and his own contract situation. He hadn't been offered an extension and was salty about it. The front office would fine him $50,000 for behavior detrimental to the team. This ended up overshadowing his best stretch in the NBA. In the final 23 games of the 2001-2002 campaign, Olowokandi looked like a dominant force, averaging 16.5 points and 9.6 rebounds. Of course, the team did lose 10 of those final 13 games. As for the center, was this a sign of things to come, or was it simply fool's gold? Turns out, a little of both. Olowokandi headed into that offseason as a restricted free agent. It was widely reported he was looking to sign an offer sheet. There were a few different suitors for his services, and he would even go on to take a meeting with the Denver Nuggets. Despite interest, no contract was forthcoming from another team. At one point in time, LA had actually offered Olowokandi a 7-year contract with $8 million or so annually. He didn't take it, and when no other offers were presented to him during free agency, he would go on to sign a 1-year qualifying offer worth $6.1 million from LA. Turning down that original contract from the Clippers would prove to be a huge mistake. Olowokandi did not play in the preseason due to left knee tendonitis. He would be in and out of the lineup during the early parts of the season. This gave him plenty of time to ponder his future out loud, which he often did in the media. He was constantly talking up various teams and not so subtly running down the Clippers, even hinting to Scott Howard Cooper that the team's players weren't happy and would rather be playing somewhere else. After a 1-season resurgence, LA was bad again. Head coach Alvin Gentry would be fired in season. It was just a mess. Olowokandi's knee problems never improved, and he would have surgery in February. The big man was expected to miss a month, but never played another game for the Clippers again. Neither side seemed all that bothered by the outcome. A big man with knee issues was not exactly a hot commodity on the free agent market, with Olowokandi's only real offer coming in the form of a 3-year, $16.2 million pact with the Minnesota Timberwolves. He was constantly injured during his spell and had become nothing more than another lumbering NBA big of the 2000s. His time with the Timberwolves is probably best remembered for non-playing related activities. He was stun-gunned at an Indianapolis bar called Tiki Bob's after he refused to leave. A couple of months after that, the Candyman got into an on-court skirmish with Nene and was suspended for multiple games. During the following season, he would be traded to Boston, where he just sort of quietly disappeared after the 2006-2007 season. Since then, Olowokandi has been a ghost. Even former teammates aren't sure where he is at these days. He came into the world of basketball out of the blue with a phone call to the University of Pacific, and disappeared just as suddenly. In many ways, a fitting end to his career. What is the legacy of Michael Olowokandi? Saying he is a bust and among the worst number 1 picks ever neglects the bigger story here. Olowokandi came to America as a 20-year-old with no real basketball experience and developed tremendous skills for a player with only 3 years under his belt. Unfortunately, he was taken first in the NBA draft based on what other people thought he could be, a collection of artificial projections and what-ifs.
So he has nothing but an upside, Ernie.
He then found himself in the worst possible situation given what he needed as a basketball player, a lockout year with the most dysfunctional franchise in NBA history. It was always going to end in failure.
But when you look at Olowokandi, with the name,
Olowokandi needed a team and front office that not only understood how to develop talent, but could micromanage him at every step along the way. Instead, he got no on-the-job training with a team where rookies went to fail. The Clippers had 15 first-round draft picks between 1990 and 2002. Only Loy Vaught would receive a long-term contract extension from the franchise. Danny Ferry flat out refused to play there. No young player had success with the Clippers during this time. Expecting Olowokandi to be the exception was naive. That brings us to the worst thing about the gripes Kareem and the late Bill Walton had about Olowokandi not being a great player or living up to the hype. Not only did they overlook the situation in which the center was placed in, but they took away from the bigger picture. They were so obsessed with what never was that they completely ignored a remarkable reality. A person going from a total basketball novice at 20 to having a 9-year NBA career. That is what makes Michael Olowokandi's story so complicated. He probably could have been an NBA All-Star. He could have also been a mechanical engineer in London. We want the legacies of athletes to fit into these tidy compartments: bust, Hall of Famer, GOAT, bum, role player, whatever the case may be. When you do that to a player like Olowokandi, you end up missing out on the true legacy. An inspirational tale, what should also serve as a warning. A player who accomplished so much, and yet is remembered for so little.
and I just think his upside is as good as anybody in the league and probably better than anybody in the league.